The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing, of restoration, and of hope.
But educate a girl, and you educate her entire family.
There is a sun within every person.
When that anger sets in, write it. Write the letters, but don't send them. You never want to leave concrete proof of insanity.
Good evening. There are many reasons for UCSB to be proud to present Moulay Hicham Ben Abdallah, Prince of Morocco, as a Regents lecturer. Rather than dwell on his credentials, I thought it might be more helpful to describe briefly what makes him such a valuable guest to our campus. First of all, a few words on his relations to monarchy. Most Americans, if they think about monarchy and royalty at all, consider it to be a politically antiquated form of government, with only the dubious claim to our attention arising from the glamour and privilege of royals. Perhaps useful to generate guests for Larry King Live, but hardly very relevant to the travails of the world. This impression is not entirely false, but it is far from complete. The enormous outpouring of grief after the death of Princess Diana of Britain 6 years ago made many of us aware that a royal personality may be sometimes more beloved than an elected leader in a democracy. Given the outcome of recent presidential elections in the United States, this may no longer seem strange to us. Similarly, King Juan Carlos of Spain made a historic contribution to his country by making possible a smooth transition from the cruel dictatorship of Franco to a benevolent democracy. In significant respects, Moulay Hicham resembles both of these exceptional royal figures. Like them, he appreciates that royalty is more about the burdens of responsibility than it is about privilege, and that royalty presents special opportunities to serve society. Moulay Hicham is admired and loved by the people of Morocco, and he has courageously used his position there to push the monarchy in Morocco to keep faith with the principles and practices of constitutional democracy. Concretely, he has not been timid about criticizing the monarchy when it encroaches on free speech or threatens human rights. To take such stands is neither simple nor without risks. Moulay Hicham was recently singled out in a New Yorker article that described the struggle of a dissenting Moroccan magazine publisher, Abu Bakr Jamai, to maintain his freedoms. Morocco has yet to discard some of the trappings of authoritarian rule to become a full-fledged constitutional democracy, and remains a battleground that depends on warriors such as Moulay Hicham if it is to move forward. The other special quality that our guest brings to us this evening is to speak to us as an eloquent, intelligent, and moderate Muslim. Moulay Hicham is personally devout and religiously observant. At the same time, he favors limiting the role of religion in the public life of society. And while deeply respectful of tradition, Moulay Hicham is also a strong believer in the indispensable contributions of modernity to the betterment of society. In this post-9/11 world, It is disturbingly common to associate Islam with political extremism and to subscribe mindlessly to the inflammatory voices of Islamophobia, which only bring fear and injustice to our land. Moulay Hicham's interpretation of the world lends powerful witness to the possibility of a far more hopeful and mutually beneficial relationship between Islam and the West, a possibility we all need to explore with a sense of urgency. In his young life, Moulay Hicham has already compiled a long list of achievements that have already been very summarily alluded to by Chancellor Yang, and I will not describe any more of them. Let me just say that I believe Moulay Hicham is a genuine world citizen who is doing his best not only to improve the condition of life in Morocco, but the life circumstances of everyone on the planet. Having known him since he was a student at Princeton about 15 years ago, I can say from the bottom of my heart that our speaker this evening is truly, and in all respects, a wonderful person. It is both my joy and honor to present Moulay Hicham to deliver the Regent's lecture on the topic of the arc of crisis after Iraq, confusion and turmoil from the Mediterranean to the subcontinent. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Dr. Yang. Thank you, Richard Falk. I'm very touched by your introduction. I don't want to get too emotional, but you know it comes from the bottom of my heart. Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking everyone who has made this talk possible here at UC Santa Barbara. I'm honored to be invited as a University of California lecturer, Regents lecturer. This institution has earned an excellent reputation throughout the world, and I am pleased to participate with you for a few days, unfortunately, in this great intellectual community. In my talk, I will attempt to give you an understanding of what people in our region feel about the dramatic events which are unfolding. Hence, my perspective will be an Arab perspective. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, some American policymakers became enamored of the idea, as one US official at the time recalled, that the Islamic forces could be used against the Soviet Union. The theory was there was an arc of crisis, and so the arc of Islam could be used to contain the Soviets. It was essentially, as our witness says, a Brzezinski concept. After all, conservative Islamic forces had been used to marginalize and defeat secular, nationalist, and leftist parties throughout the region, beginning with Iran in 1954. Perhaps it was thought Iranian fundamentalism could catalyze Islamic insurgency in the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. Subsequently, the United States explored various, sometimes conflicting policies in the Middle East and Central Asia, while always prioritizing its main goals of prevailing in the Cold War, winning in the Cold War, supporting Israel. American policy wavered towards Islamic fundamentalism and even towards which states it either supported or opposed at different times. On the one hand, the United States officially favored Iraq in its war against Iran. On the other hand, it acquiesced to arms shipments to Iran. The pièce de résistance, of course, of this American policy was the alliance with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to create an international jihadi army, freedom fighters, as they were called at the time, to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Hence, Brzezinski concept quickly became Casey's War. In 1991, with the Soviet Union gone, the United States organized an international coalition to evict the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Arab states from Syria to Morocco were invited and responded positively to an appeal that was based on international law and United Nations resolutions. They were assured that this was just not about saving a dependable oil monarchy, but beyond this, it was about creating a new regime of international justice. And after Kuwait's sovereignty was restored, there would be a new world order in which all UN resolutions would be enforced, including those which pertained to Israeli withdrawal from occupied Arab lands. More importantly, the resolutions that are best known are 242 and 338. And after the quick rout and defeat of the Iraqi army from Kuwait, there was considerable pressure to continue on to Baghdad and overthrow Saddam's regime. Calmer voices, however, prevailed, and at the end of the day, there was no such intervention. As one key player remarked at the time, and let me read you briefly his quote, which I think is important, "If we were going to remove Saddam, we would have to commit a lot of force. And once we'd done that, and we'd gotten rid of Saddam and his government, then we'd had to put another government in its place. What kind of government? Should it be a Sunni government? Should it be a Shia government? A Kurdish government? A Ba'athi regime? Or maybe we want to bring some Islamic fundamentalists? How long would you have had to stay in Baghdad to keep that government in place? What would happen to the government once US forces withdrew? How many casualties should the United States accept in that effort to try to create clarity and stability in a situation that is inherently unstable? It's my view that it would have been a mistake for us to get bogged down in the quagmire inside Iraq. And the question in my mind is, how many additional American casualties is Saddam worth? And the answer is not very damned many. That quote, ladies and gentlemen, was the considered opinion of the American Secretary of Defense at the time, Dick Cheney. Those who urged regime change at the time in Iraq, hegemonists who wanted the US to expand its sole superpower status with military force, and supporters of Israel's desire to remove Iraq from the Arab-Israeli equation, could take comfort in the decades-long regime sanctions which followed, forming organized pressure groups like PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. They shifted easily between Israeli and American political establishments at the highest level, and they ceaselessly militated and built political support for a future attack against Iraq when the conditions would permit so. The Israelis, meanwhile, were comforted by seeing Secretary of State James Baker's brief attempt to put teeth into official US policy regarding the occupied territories, deftly swatted off. Never again would there be any serious attempt by any American administration to stop Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank. The peace process started with fanfare with Baker at the Madrid conference and sealed, in quotes, after 1996 with the Oslo Agreement, became a cover essentially for doubling of settler population in the West Bank. For the Palestinians, their new world order was just more of the same. Further east along what I call the arc of crisis, the denouement of the war in Afghanistan was played out between the warlords of the Northern Alliance and the fanatics of the Taliban. With the Cold War over, the United States deferred to the interests of Pakistan, which was itself turning towards Islamic governance, and for whom an Islamist Afghanistan represented strategic depth against its arch rival India. Pakistan's ISI, the military branch for intelligence, which had been the operation coordinator of the anti-war Soviet, was quite happy to assure or guarantee a Taliban victory and have and cultivate ties with the resultant regime. The point of all this, the point which I want to make, is as follows. For decades leading up to the present predicament, the policies of the United States, the most powerful country, towards Arab and Muslim concerns were entirely instrumental. Policies were made, armies raised, alliances formed and broken, wars fought over the lands, over the bodies of Arabs, Muslims, for reasons that always had to do with something or someone else. the inconsistencies and constant reversals of policies towards Iraq, Iran, Shiite fundamentalism, Sunni fundamentalism, jihadi ideology, monarchical absolutism, democracy, dictatorship, Arafat, PLO, Israeli extension, I could go on forever, demonstrate how Arab and Muslim concerns were always treated as dispensable elements of policies designed for other reasons. Whether it was to assure stable oil supply, to win the Cold War, to remain as to maintain hegemony as the only superpower, or to support Israel. Once one of these primary motives was satisfied, any of Arab Muslim concerns that had been evoked to garner support were indefinitely ignored and put off. Nothing is more noticeable, nothing is more insulting to the Arab and Muslim world than this instrumentalist nonchalance with which we have been treated. No words exemplify this attitude better and more clearly than Brzezinski's famous response when asked 3 years before 9/11 whether he regretted setting up an international jihadi army to contain the Soviets or to evict the Soviets from Afghanistan. And I will quote him again, I'll quote him. Regret what? What is more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? No situation embodies this attitude more disturbingly than America's ignoring of its own promises, policies, laws in relation to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Many have said, I have said, and I will repeat it again, the unwillingness of the United States to take on its responsibility for ending this historic injustice suffered by the Palestinian people, the idea that this can be allowed to go on forever, as long as the Israeli government or some domestic constituencies, and there are many in the United States, are placated, is the single greatest obstacle to changing the character and the intensity of conflict, of violence in the Middle East and in the Muslim world. So underlying this arc of crisis is an attitude of complacency and nonchalance about how long the Arab and Muslim world can be expected or forced to put up with this. This is the field on which the world-changing events of the past 5 years have been played out. Since September 11th, 2001, which changed the political climate tremendously in the United States, to the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which has even more profoundly affected the geopolitics of the arc of crisis and beyond. We must now cast a cold eye, a cold look on the constellation of forces in these emerging scenarios. It is confused, uncertain, and far from a pretty picture. But we can bring it into some focus by looking at three nodal points along the crisis, along the arc of crisis. First node is the Palestine, Lebanon, Israel nexus. The second nexus, I contend, is Iraq and Iran. And the third is the Afghanistan and Pakistan nexus. We begin with the most dramatic scene, the Iraq-Iran crisis. As many of us remarked in 2003, in fact, before the intervention in Iraq, there was only one outcome that would produce an American victory in this country: a quick transition to an unoccupied, stable, united, democratic, and non-theocratic state. A lesser outcome: prolonged occupation, resistance, the rise of an authoritarian state, of a theology, the specter of partition. All of these are simply, or would be perceived as, failure. It was a huge gamble. Only the self-deluded could believe otherwise. Well, we must be clear on what the situation is now today. The time for self-delusion and polite understatement is over. The United States has suffered a grave political and military defeat in Iraq. We can dwell on, no, it's not military defeat. Yes, it's maybe not for some people taking decisions that 3,000 people dead is not a military defeat compared to other experiences. But the fact that the most powerful army is in a green zone and cannot stop the sectarian killing and the resistance is a failure. It's a failure and a defeat, and we have to be clear about it. One retired American general calls it the greatest strategic disaster in United States history. The defeat is an accomplished fact. No study group, no surge in troops, no military adventure in Iraq or elsewhere will change this fact. And the United States can do a lot more damage in the region. It can prolong its own pain in the process, but it cannot change this defeat in a victory. And it is evident that one immediate winner in this conflict is Iran. The American strategy of disbanding the army and de-Ba'athizing the state removed Iran's traditional enemy from the region, while America's reliance on Shiite clerics empowered Iran's allies inside Iraq. As a result of its own actions, the United States now confronts a greatly strengthened Iran, and not from the position of military strength or political confidence, which the neoconservatives had projected originally. The consequences of this are far-reaching for the United States and for the entire Arab and Muslim world. For the last 2 decades, the left-leaning secular Arab nationalism that defined the ideological framework of resistance to the West has been losing ground in favor of Islamist currents that fold militant anti-imperialist tropes into deeply conservative religious ideologies. Political conflicts over national independence and paths of development are morphing into religious conflicts over communal and cultural identities. As we suggested above, this paradigm shift was sometimes abetted and helped by the West. Now the American debacle in Iraq has handed Iran new opportunities to take up the fight of Arab nationalism under the banner of Islam. The Iranian Revolution was often perceived in the past as a Shiite or Persian phenomenon, with little appeal to Sunni Arabs and Muslims alike, even some nationalist-minded Shiites in the Arab world, Arabs themselves, like Sistani, Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, or Fadlallah in Lebanon, have problems and had problems with Iran's political theology of Wilayat al-Faqih. But they too now take comfort in Iran's new strength. Persian Iran is emerging as a champion of a new front of struggle that combines Arab nationalism with a rising tide of Islamic resistance. And this puts Iran in the center of a Middle East storm with a lot of options and a lot of possibilities. It can ease the American exit out of Iraq, or can make life nasty for the American troops. It can help to keep the Israelis at bay through help of Hezbollah. It can even extend a lifeline of support to Hamas if it chooses in Palestine. Its influence extends to the Shiite-dominated oil-producing areas of Arabia and the Gulf. It is poised to fill a huge vacuum of regional power created by the destruction of the Iraqi state. Iran has become a frontline state with the potential to affect the course of the Palestine-Israeli conflict and to transform the centuries-old Sunni-Shiite divide in the region. The fact that the United States and Israel, whether separately or collectively, are turning a threatening gaze on Iran only confirms its new strategic importance and enhances its status as the vanguard of resistance for the entire Arab and Muslim world. As much as they think they will gain long-term advantage from attacking Iraq, there is no possibility for action beyond airstrikes and beyond limited commandos or special forces operation. These will not destroy the Iranian regime. They will only cement it and increase its resolve. Because the Americans and Israelis know this, and because they nonetheless may think it is imperative to prevent Iran from assuming the powerful position that's been prepared for it during these decades, there is a possibility that an attack on Iran will involve the use of nuclear weapons. This possibility has been raised by the President and the Vice President of the United States and has been reported based on military sources. America's bind in Iraq and Israel's in Lebanon have dissipated, and this is a new thing in the region, have dissipated the fear of inevitable defeat, which discouraged resistance in the past. The thinking today may be that using nuclear weapons would be the only way, without large numbers of troops, to achieve a level of destruction that can not only set Iran back enough to make a difference, but also reset the balance or reset the balance of fear in the region. Such an attack would be, in my opinion, the highest folly. Even if the United States could destroy the Iranian regime, which I think it cannot, the consequences would be a regional instability and a global isolation that would create unprecedented dangers for both Israel and the United States. Armies could wreak a lot of havoc, but destruction is not victory. Political weakness will almost always lead to defeat, no matter who has the fanciest or the fancier weapons. Another superficially shrewd strategy being floated around involves curtailing Iran by exploiting the centuries-old Sunni-Shiite divide with the help of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And here two contradictions or contradictory tendencies are at work regarding the old Sunni-Shiite split. On the one hand, there is a conjunctural tendency towards rapprochement, especially since the Lebanese war, which has revealed the obvious affinities between Iran, Hezbollah, and to a lesser extent, Hamas, and has made Hassan Nasrallah a hero throughout the Arab world. Theologically respected Sunni clerics, like Yusuf Qaradawi and others, have proclaimed that the Sunni-Shiite differences concern minor rather than foundational aspects of Islam, what we call furu' rather than usul, the branches and not the source of Islam. It has been centuries since Sunni ulamas have so openly declared the fundamentally Islamic nature of Shi'ism and the secondary nature of the divergences or the differences. On the other hand, elsewhere in the region, there are rising tensions between the two families of Islam, particularly, of course, in Iraq, where a difficult change in power relations has been fueling sectarian strife, and where and had been exacerbated recently by the theater of sectarian revenge and insult at the shameful way in which Saddam has been executed. In addition, Shiite populations concentrated in strategically important sites throughout the Arab world have been a mistreated undercaste viewed with fear and disdain, and thus filled with anger and resentment that could become trouble for a number of regimes in the area. Thus, there seems to be some thought that Saudi Arabia could become the banker of a region-wide Sunni movement to resist heretical or deviant Shiism. Saudi Arabia is indeed very worried and bristling at the prospect that Shiite theology and Islamic Republican politics might take root in the region, and has already pledged to protect Iraq's Sunnis. Now, can Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, Egypt, Jordan, the Kurds, the Iraqi and Lebanese Sunnis and Fatah, with the support of the United States and Israel, be able to counter the influence of Shiite Iran, Alawite Syria, with their allies Hezbollah and possibly Hamas? Official and private Saudi sources and Gulf sources will certainly finance Sunni militants everywhere in the region, but they'll be hard-pressed to match Iran's political and military clout. To have any political credibility, they would need to produce at the outset a resolution to the Palestinian issue that would be perceived as just throughout the region. Nevertheless, it would be foolish for them, even suicidal for the Saudis, to enter this game without such an achievement to their credit. And the Americans and the Israelis are not likely to grant it, since the Israelis, at least, in the very least, would be entering, if they enter into this game, it would be precisely to avoid it to begin with. This is really a recipe for intra-Muslim civil war throughout the Middle East, and those undertaking it would be perceived as Muslim proxies tearing apart our community on behalf of the United States, that this will be the perception, and in a way that will be viewed as serving Israeli interests. And more practical questions. Who would those Saudi and Gulf-financed Sunni, Shiite, or anti-Shiite forces be, Muslim forces be? In Iraq, for example, Western constituencies, even the American public, might notice with dismay that their government was again building up Salafi jihadi armies, Al-Qaeda, just with another name. Yes, this scenario can wreak enormous havoc in the Arab and Muslim world. It will not, however, yield victory, but a slew of immense crises for the United States and Israel alike. That we are even thinking about such possibilities attests to the extremely dangerous dynamic that had been set in motion, and to those who seem committed to it. The neoconservatives call it creative destruction. But one astute commentator more aptly dubs it statecide. There's nothing creative about it, ladies and gentlemen. And now we turn to the Palestinian-Lebanon flashpoint along the crisis, and it seems that the United States again embraces, or at least ends up accepting, such a strategy. And one can understand why, judging from effect, not necessarily intention, only from effect, it's hard for Arabs and Muslims to avoid the conclusion that the United States policy in the Middle East is not about repairing failed states as much as it is about creating them. The events surrounding Israel's summer war on Lebanon illustrate this problem. Let me be clear. Yes, Hezbollah's capture of 2 Israeli soldiers was a provocative act. Let me be clear too, that Hezbollah's rocket attacks on Israeli civilians are as condemnable and as reprehensible as Israel's bombing of civilian infrastructure. We should be clear too, there is also a principle of proportionality of international law to consider here. Hezbollah's action was a relatively mundane occurrence in the context of a long-standing, outstanding issues of Israeli occupation of Lebanese territory, of incursions into airspace and territory, and of the refusal to free Lebanese prisoners held since 2004. And everyone understands that it was a limited tactic specifically addressing this prisoner issue. No one believed that it was the first shot in a general attack on Israel's entire civilian infrastructure. Does anyone believe that Hezbollah or the Lebanese army were planning to invade Israel? To bomb the roads, bridges, power plants, whole towns, and airports to get back their captured prisoners? Would anyone think that was justified? Yet this is exactly what happened. And with the perception on the Arab street that Israel had America's blessing. As one group remarked, the fact that civilian structures that were part of the major rebuilding of Lebanon by Rafiq Hariri were destroyed in less than 48 hours with American weapons is a sad commentary on the lack of real American policy and understanding towards the region. And none of the military actions are at all helpful to Israel. The United States has already paid a big price for its role in this little war. The sight of Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora tearfully begging the United States to restrain Israel from devastating his country. And the cold shoulder he's received in response may go down as a turning point in America's relation to the Arab world. The March 14 movement that took power through an American and French-backed Cedar Revolution was lauded as exactly the kind of reform the United States and the West hoped to foster in the region. Siniora was as friendly to the United States as any Lebanese prime minister before him. But in the face of the desire to teach Lebanon a lesson, Siniora would get no break from the United States. The United States, in other words, turned its back on a friendly leader of a fragile democracy which posed no threat to anyone in the region. Neither the United States government nor any politician of stature would utter a word of criticism against this aggression. More than this, America blocked any ceasefire for a month in the United Nations Security Council. So deep was US's involvement in this war that equipment was flown in or was given at the disposal of Israel. America has now doubled those emergency stocks which were used, with the understanding that Israel can use them in any future attack it might deem necessary. They have also given Israel, in the eyes of the Arab masses, $4.5 billion in guarantees to help pay for last summer's war. American weapons were among the 2 to 3 million cluster bomblets dropped over Lebanon. 90% of them, 90% of this weaponry in the last 72 hours of the war, when everybody knew a ceasefire was imminent. This is the perception on the Arab street. And in the words of an Israeli commander, and you can readily verify all these references, this commander, which had participated in this war, said the following: "What we did was insane and monstrous. We covered entire towns with cluster bombs. These policies may go unreported or unremarked in the United States. But ladies and gentlemen, you may know that they are widely broadcast and vigorously discussed and debated in the Israeli press, in the Arab and world press. And after this war, I'm afraid it will be very difficult to persuade the Arab Muslim world that the United States won't betray any ostensible ally, ignore any important principle to support an Israeli aggression against whomever it sees. The result was not only that Sinura described as the unimaginable destruction of the Lebanese civil war, not only a blow to America's standing and stature in the region, it was also the weakening of the Sinura government itself. Hezbollah today is now demanding a bigger role in a unity government, in a Cedar revolution in reverse. And it is organizing its own massive, peaceful and disciplined street demonstrations. Well, unfortunately, they're not as peaceful as we saw in the news these last days, mimicking the tactics that the United States and the West had praised and promoted a year earlier. It is easy for Hezbollah to portray Sinura as weak and incapable of defending the nation from aggression, not concerned about appearing to take sides in the context of what is an international or internal struggle. Now we see a doubling of American aid to Lebanese army, which is intensifying its recruitment in distinct populations among the Sunnis and the Druze. The rationale is to make the army capable of disarming Hezbollah. Hezbollah, on the other hand, will point out that this helps to create the conditions of a civil war in Lebanon, a new one, and demonstrates that the United States and Sinura are more interested in using the Lebanese army against its own citizens than protecting the country against foreign invaders. The result, I would contend, is that Israel's attack on Lebanon, though it created enormous destruction, also ended in a political defeat, and a military one. It was clearly a political defeat outside of the narrowly framed discourse in the United States. As a result, Israel is even more isolated in the region and the world. This was also the first military defeat for Israel in a long time. Hezbollah had better intelligence, better tactics. They had never lost their ability to communicate efficiently among themselves and to broadcast via television and radio to a wider audience, including a pan-Arab audience, not just a Lebanese audience, and to inflict casualties, commandos, on advancing Israeli forces. The Israelis, on the other hand, did not achieve their goals, either the disarmament of Hezbollah or the liberation of the captured soldiers. The looming question for Israel and the United States is whether they can accept these failures or whether they will be tempted to double down with more force in order to achieve some of their goals, or at least to restore some power of intimidation. Are these defeats the harbingers of a new fourth generation? Or are they temporary setbacks, fixable with an application of more and better managed force? One thing is certain. The Serbia and Gulf War model of casualty-free victory via heavy bombing and high-tech weaponry is over. These are battles for the long-term control of hearts and allegiances of populations. In such conflicts, air power, no matter how destructive, ladies and gentlemen, cannot secure a decisive victory. The destruction of the country's civilian infrastructure, the undermining of the political and social coherence, and the creation of a dynamic leading to sectarian war and civil war. When this dynamic accelerated in Iraq, it seemed as a terrible unintended consequence. When the same elements are put into play in Lebanon, it might strike us as a coincidence. When the sudden dynamic suddenly unfolds in a third polity in the neighborhood, the Palestinian territories, a lot of observers will call this a pattern. There is at least a circumstantial case to this effect. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the perception of Arab and Muslim opinion. The situation now in the Palestinian territories is a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions. The Israelis have always felt entitled to do what they want in these territories. And since the much celebrated disengagement, they have treated Gaza little more as a free fire zone. Since the victory of Hamas in January's last election, the United States and Europe have joined in the effort to starve the Palestinians into rejecting their own democratically elected government. The predictable result of these assaults is a breakdown of social order. the breakdown of the fabric of society, and a slide towards civil war and civil conflict. As one astute American journalist who was in Gaza points out, who's published this, let me read you his picture of Palestine. Palestinians in Gaza live encased in a squalid, overcrowded ghetto, surrounded by the Israeli military and a massive electric fence. Unable to leave or enter the strip and under daily assault, the concerted Israeli attempts to orchestrate a breakdown in law and order to foster chaos and rampant deprivation are on public display in the streets of Gaza City, where Palestinians walk past the rubble of the Palestinian Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of National Economy, the Office of the Palestinian Prime Minister, and the number of educational institutions that have been bombed by Israeli jets. The electricity generation plant, providing 45% of the electricity of Gaza Strip, has been wiped out. And even the primitive electricity networks and transmitters that remain have been repeatedly bombed. 6 bridges linking Gaza City with the central Gaza Strip have been blown up, and main arteries cratered into destruction. And the West Bank is rapidly descending into a crisis of Gaza proportions. What do Israel and Washington believe they will gain by turning Gaza and the West Bank into a miniature version of Iraq? Do they believe that creating a Hobbesian nightmare for the Palestinians will blunt terrorism, curb suicide attacks, and foster peace? One hopes that Lebanon and Palestine are not becoming this miniature version of Iraq. But the pattern is noticeable. In a new stratagem that has prompted some concern in the Israeli press, because I believe the Israeli press is a democratic and vibrant press, and we in the Arab world refer to it a lot, whether it be Haaretz or Yehuda or not. This is what a journalist has to say. The United States, with Israel's help, is providing advanced weapons to 417 militants in Gaza associated with Fatah strongman Mahmoud Dahlan. And according to Israeli and Palestinian security officials, the US weapons shipment have prompted an arms race between Hamas and Fatah. Whatever the intent, the logic of social disintegration and civil war is unfolding via American policy in 3 areas that Israel has always identified as sites of resistance to its regional ambitions. The famous 1996 strategy paper for Israeli Prime Minister of the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, and authored by some of the neoconservatives who later were to become those who shaped foreign policy under George W. Bush, urged, and I quote, a clean break from the slogan comprehensive peace to a traditional concept of strategy based on balance of power, and advised that this could be achieved by removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, aggressively engaging Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran, and generally destabilizing and rolling back dangerous threats. As far as this strategy goes, the mission indeed has largely been accomplished. And if the clean break paper called for destabilizing the Palestinian threat by nurturing alternatives to Arafat at the time, and Arafat's exclusive grip on Palestinian society, this strategy today means rearming Fatah against the very alternative that was successfully nurtured, Hamas. The consistency is the logic of destabilization. It is understandable that there is a hardcore of right-wing Zionists for whom the Palestinian people must be subjugated within, removed from all the territory that Israel covets, and who believe this only be accomplished if Israel's recalcitrant neighbors, as well as Palestinians, are rendered too weak to resist. It is dismaying and disheartening, though, to see such zealots occupying positions of power in the Israeli government. It is shocking, too, or more so, to think that the United States might go along with this strategy, let alone put itself in front of strategy that is destructive and self-destructive, not only for Israel and the United States, but for the entire region. In the name of what? In the name of a misguided notion of what it means to be Israel's friend. Nevertheless, such a strategy sometimes seems the only explanation, other than the implausibly extreme incompetence for a chain of contradictory, counterproductive decisions that the United States has made. That the United States might be pursuing such a strategy is something. That it looks to many people like the United States is in effect pursuing this strategy is the biggest concern in our region of the world. If it were true, it would pose a grave danger for us all. It must be emphasized that the danger in following such a strategy is at least as great to the United States and Israel as for any of their targets. Friends do not enable each other's self-destruction. America urgently needs to discuss these issues openly to understand that unconditional support is neither in America's nor Israel's best interest, and to keep their country from going down this path, and to put every peaceful obstacle to prevent Israel from going down this path too. As one Israeli commentator in the Israeli press notes very briefly, Israel's policies threaten not just the Palestinians but also the Israelis themselves. A small Jewish state of 7 million residents, 5.5 million Jews, surrounded by 200 million Arabs, is making itself the enemy of the Muslim world. There is no guarantee that such a state can survive. Saving the Palestinians also means saving Israel. Israel must decide, will its security in the region be assured by forcing its neighbors to accept its hegemony through relentless use of military power? Or is it more likely to be secured by cultivating mutually respectful relations with its neighbors, beginning with the Palestinians? The first choice requires lobbying American politicians and engorging its conventional and nuclear military capabilities while keeping all its neighbors weak. The latter choice would require acknowledging the injustice that has been done to the Palestinians and the rights that are owed to the Palestinians, negotiating fair, secure borders based on international law, reducing the potential for violence by negotiating reductions of armament, including theirs, and the prevention of anyone else's nuclear arsenal. The latter path may be difficult for Israel to adjust to, but the former strategy, Israel's choice for decades, is reaching the end of its useful life cycle. If in the Middle East, the United States is reaping a whirlwind of failures and resentment sown by its own miscalculations, further east along the arc of crisis, it faces possibly another setback, an embarrassing one. Underestimating the tenacity of its enemy, oversimplifying the cultural and political challenges of a country larger and more populous than Iraq, and too willing to turn attention elsewhere while relying on another regional ally with a complicated and incongruent agenda of its own, the United States and NATO are seriously challenged in Afghanistan. After 9/11, no one questioned America's right to go after Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden with force. The decision to launch a wide-ranging military campaign involving NATO in order to reconstruct the politics of the entire country was, however, full with risks. Success would require a decisive military victory, followed by a firm, lasting political, financial, social reform. Such a strategy would also depend on respected and reliable local allies who were equally committed to the same political agenda. In reality, the United States relied on the warlords of the Northern Alliance for quick results in the field, and an imported president to cobble together a shell of what would become a central government. The warlords were fickle allies whose corruption and brutality had lent credibility to the Taliban to begin with, and neither they nor Karzai were capable of making continuing Western military activity seem part of an agenda that was sensible and attractive to the patchwork of the fiercely independent and rival ethnic loyalties that define the politics and the society of Afghanistan. To make matters worse, the United States failed to eliminate the top leaders of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, diverting crucial forces and resources from the hunt of bin Laden to Iraq. It was clear that despite the more direct connection and link between 9/11 and Afghanistan and the proclaimed war on terror, Afghanistan was only of secondary importance. As a result, bin Laden and Zawahiri continue to issue videos today, and the Taliban, who maintain close ties with the Pashtun tribes on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistani border, are regrouping in strength and posing a real threat to NATO forces. The French have already pulled out their best forces, and it is uncertain how longer NATO countries will remain or how effective they will be in the future. Having one's forces hunkered down in compounds, not ensuring, not even participating in the administration of the country, and only coming out or emerging to execute air raids and operations creates a military and politically untenable situation. America's clumsy attempt to engineer a noble and simple battle between itself and Al-Qaeda has stumbled not only on the intricacies of Afghan tribal and warlord politics, but also into the complicated, very complicated and risky game that Pakistan has been playing with Islamic fundamentalism throughout the region. And since the instauration of military rule in Pakistan, the Pakistani government and ISI have nurtured and attempted to control the various forms of Islamic fundamentalism and radicalism for their own purposes. The Taliban were combining a Pashtun identity and an Islamist identity were seen as convenient tool against Baluch nationalism and also against the Iranian influence, increasing Iranian influence. Iran, which was always opposed to the Taliban, gave tactical intelligence support to the Americans and the Northern Alliance after 9/11, and has also been participating, by the way, to build Afghan infrastructure. Pakistan is concerned about the growth of this Iranian soft power. Of course, Pakistan's central preoccupation remains India and the Kashmir, and Pakistan sees the internal Islamist groups as providing the hard edge of its struggle in the Kashmir, and it sees its ally, the Taliban, without Al-Qaeda, as providing a belt of containment against the Iranian regime and a powerful strategic depth or important strategic depth against its powerful Hindu neighbor. For the ISI and the Pakistani political establishment then, the alliance with Islamism has become an element or a structural element of a strategic policy. During the anti-Soviet war, this strategy meshed nicely with the agendas of the United States and the Afghani resistance. The Pakistani military and political elites and establishment were confident that traditional social hierarchies could coexist and endure alongside the radical madrasas and the fundamentalism that they were cultivating around them. It is much harder to play both sides of this fence when the United States is perceived as an invader and occupier of Afghanistan and other Muslim lands. 20 years ago, the United States too was able to instrumentalize Pakistan's instrumentalization of these Islamic groups. Today, Pakistan feels a shock for every American blow made against Muslims. And any failure of the United States to defeat the Taliban quickly, to win the hearts and minds of Muslims in Afghanistan and Pakistan, now weakens the US allied Pakistani regime itself. Thus, Pakistan is now urging NATO and Afghan government to accept the inevitability of moderate Taliban presence in Afghanistan and has ceded control of one of its own provinces or regions to North Waziristan to the Taliban. Of course, this threatens to create a base from which the not-so-moderate Taliban attack NATO forces in Afghanistan. It also gives Al-Qaeda and its offshoots a haven from which to import and export tactics and personnel from Iraq and elsewhere. The Iraq-Afghani connection via Al-Qaeda is now a reality. Suicide bombings, previously unseen in the Afghani conflict, is one tactic now recently imported from Iraq. We may be witnessing the Al-Qaedization of Pakistan and the Pakistanization of Al-Qaeda. In a scenario that demonstrates how little control of the situation either partner has, Karzai is denouncing Musharraf, who is pleading his own inability to do more. An American defeat in Afghanistan, with all its destabilizing consequences for Pakistan, may not be an irreversible fact. In fact, it could be avoidable. It seems to be an Iraq which is contrary to that. But the situation is grave and deteriorating, and every soldier and bullet and dollar the United States spends in Iraq will just make matters worse. In short, and to conclude, there is truly an arc of crisis from the Levant to the subcontinent, and it is hard to see how the tension might subside in the near future. In the next few months, decisions will be made that will either exacerbate these crises or turn in a new direction more amenable to sensible solutions. To take this turn will require leadership in the West, and especially in the United States, that understands that Al-Qaeda, the Ba'ath, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Syria, are not all reducible to the same abstract ideological category of evil terrorism. We need leadership that is capable of both understanding the linkages and the decoupling and diffusing the elements of these crises. We need someone who's willing, for example, just an example, to take Syria, a country that doesn't threaten the United States, that has already cooperated in the United States in a number of situations, and has its own legitimate interests in the Golan, to make a deal with the Golan, which is rightfully theirs, and whose occupation brings no benefit to the United States. Similarly with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, who are acting primarily on their own concerns and on behalf of the local communities with real grievances, and with whom the United States has no battle regarding anything in its own national interest. The United States, in acting this way, can take a lot of elements, a lot of issues off the table and advance its own interests, and in the process help defeat fanatical terrorism, which is really hurting the entire region. These groups are not all the same. They are not Al-Qaeda, and left alone, they will not become Al-Qaeda any more than Vietnam one day became the tool of an evil empire. Engaged cautiously but fairly, they could become manageable adversaries. The Baker-Hamilton Group has suggested such a change of direction. President Jimmy Carter has called for an honest debate about United States policy in the region. Nevertheless, these pragmatic, moderate establishment voices are being resisted by neoconservative and militant factions which seem to hold sway over the President and Congress. Repairing these damages already done would require a lot, and they would require first acknowledging wrong decisions and moving towards very serious policy changes. It would require abandoning the idea that unilateral military force can help solve complex political and social issues. Above all, it would require abandoning the idea that the diverse and rich nations of the area, of the Middle East, of Arabs and Muslims alike, are interchangeable elements of a single ideological scheme to be manipulated for the benefit of someone or something else, whether it be the geopolitical needs of great powers, whether it be the unconditional support of Israel or the oil demands of the West. The world awaits to see, in this critical moment, to see if the United States is prepared to forego an ideological campaign in favor of intelligent leadership and statesmanship, a cautious but fair negotiation from a position of political strength. We're not naive in the region, with real movements that have real and specific grievances. Nobody expects the United States to ignore conflicting agendas or its interests, but the world needs its most powerful country to stop turning every potential adversary, especially in our region, into a deadly enemy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.